Story 1. I remember skipping school as a teenager, and my teacher called my dad. When I got home, I was tied to a chair with rope and whipped with his leather belt. One of the whips landed on my right ear, so I had to visit a nearby clinic to check my hearing. Edit. This happened 15 years ago. Story 2. When I was 11, I got a remote control car for Christmas. A few months later, I broke it. My single mother bent a metal serving spoon across my legs from multiple hits. I had to wear trousers at school to hide the bruising and couldn't walk for a day or so. I know it was abuse. She wonders why I'm so cold to her these days. Story 3. Receiving the silent treatment for days was the hardest. It wasn't even about what I did wrong. It was the feeling of being completely ignored that wounded the most. Story 4. I got whipped with a leather belt for minor things. A few times my hair was pulled and twisted so much that my mom lifted me in the air with it, and I lost a bunch of hair back then. I was a target of her blind rage for minor things like spilling milk or making too much noise while walking. It made me a very quiet person. My mom would also deny me access to the kitchen sink and fridge, and then randomly not let me have dinner due to what she considered bad behavior. I don't think I behaved badly because I was so afraid of her. But knowing her, bad behavior could be not answering enough, not hearing, or having an expression on my face. Yes, I'm aware I lived an abusive childhood. Story 5. It went from the leather belt and leather slipper to taking away my library card. So the physical punishment stopped, and the psychological punishment began. Story 6. My dad burned all my Pokemon stuff as a punishment because he was convinced it was the work of the devil and such. The worst part is that I had some pretty valuable stuff in there too. Things like a first edition holographic Blastoise. I don't know how much value he destroyed as a punishment, but it definitely hit the quadruple digits in today's money. As a kid, I was just crying and sobbing because I lost something I loved so immensely because my dad did something utterly stupid and foolish because some religious fanatic wanted to live his 30 minutes of fame. Story 7. My father made me get out of the car on the side of the highway for arguing with my brother. He pulled ahead a few meters as if he was going to drive away and leave me there. I was terrified and bawling my eyes out. I was only 6 years old. This was decades ago, and it still upsets me when I think about it. Story 8. My dad broke my nose whipping me for leaving campus as a 6th grader. The only reason he stopped was the blood gushing everywhere. All the nonsense folks in my age bracket, Generation X, say about stuff back then was garbage. What he did, intentionally or not, was child abuse. It was criminal, and it has taken me much of my adult life to sift through the abuse I justified as discipline. Story 9. There was one time when I discovered a bag of toys in a closet intended for my Christmas stocking. I was about 8 or 9. I opened some and played with them, then put them back, and I knew I probably shouldn't have. When my mother eventually discovered what I had been doing, she was furious. She threw the toys out on the floor and made me play with them. She told me that I could no longer call her mom, but I had to call her by her first name. She said she didn't want to be my mother. There were threats of sending me away to a foster home. Story 10. My father pretended to be me when he was chatting with people on my phone after he confiscated it, so he could embarrass me by saying the weirdest things. I didn't even know he did this. I found out at school after the weekend ended when people approached me about things I said, which I had no knowledge of. Story 11. When I was a child, my mom decided I was antisocial because I had trouble making friends. It turns out I was on the autism spectrum, which teachers had indicated I needed testing for, but my parents were bootstrap-style fundamentalist Christians who strongly opposed pathologizing or treating anything psychological. I also had a lot of trauma, which added to the social complications. Anyway, she decided they needed to get rid of my books because she thought reading too much must be the reason for my social dysfunction. My stepfather agreed, but for him, it was because I liked Harry Potter, which he thought was corruptive. They burned them and made me watch. My older sister saved my Tolkien books by lying and saying she wanted them because she knew Tolkien was particularly special to me. I experienced horrible psychological, physical, and sexual abuse throughout my childhood, but watching the charred pieces of the pages of my books float away hurt me in a way that none of the other stuff did. I have a book hoarding problem now, but I am 3 years sober and have very low contact with my family. Story 12. I was 4 or 5. My dad came home from work and couldn't find the game he wanted to play on his computer. He assumed I had something to do with it, even though I didn't even know how to turn it on. I told him I didn't, so he hit me and hit me while I begged him to believe me. I had been told many times that lying was wrong, and I didn't want to lie. Finally, I confessed. About 10 minutes later, as I was crying in my room, he came in and said, "Oh, I found the game in another file. Sorry." And that was that. The second worst punishment was about a year later. Once again, it was for something I didn't do. It was like a light bulb went off in my head. The way to avoid a beating wasn't to tell the truth. It was to tell my parents whatever they wanted to hear, so I wouldn't get hit. They were very confused about why I had such a problem with lying after that. Story 13. My mom ripped the poster of my favorite band. She would also just break random stuff in my room. I wasn't allowed to have a door in my bedroom. I moved out about 8 years ago. Story 14. I was suspended from school for fighting. I had everything taken out of my room except for my bed, and I had to stay there for the whole week. A few years later, my little brother was suspended for bullying and he got no punishment. My mother definitely favored him. Story 15. My mom was trying to teach me vocabulary words for an upcoming test in school. It wasn't sinking in, so for every wrong answer after that, I had to pick a stuffed animal from my room to get rid of. That was devastating to me as a kid. I ended up with a big bag of stuffed animals I'll never see again. Story 16. When I was 6, there were older kids from my street who pointed homemade bows and arrows at me, forcing me to pull my pants down and dance about with my private parts exposed. This happened in a field behind our street. When my parents found out about it, I was shamed and treated like a deviant pervert. I wasn't allowed outside to play with the other kids that summer. Story 17. My guardian used to beat me with a piece of 2x4 for any perceived slight or embarrassment. He was really good about kicking me in the tailbone with his boot too. Story 18. I was really sick with the stomach flu when I was 10. I threw up a dozen times in as many hours. At night, I cried loudly because I was thirsty. My father told me to be quiet and wouldn't get me anything to drink. So I just lay there, tasting like puke and incredibly thirsty. Luckily, I found an old soda can under the couch to get me through the night. I don't know if it was meant as a punishment for crying and needing help, but it felt like it. Story 19. I was around 10 years old. My father didn't like that I called him out on something that pointed him out as a hypocrite. He immediately pinned me to the wall, choking my neck with both hands. I could not breathe and thought I was going to die. He only let go when my mother yelled. I will never forgive him for that. When I was about 7, I loved browsing flyers for toys. We were poor and didn't have much, definitely not many toys. He yelled at me that if I kept looking at the flyers and not studying, I would be forever poor. As a kid who did all my homework without a fuss and tried my best, this hurt a lot. Not sure if this was worse or the choking incident. Story 20. Constant correction and nitpicking that turned into bitter arguments and physical altercations. My father has some serious control issues and is very insecure, and also does not communicate except when it is time to let someone know they are not doing things right. It affects me to this day. Social anxiety, trouble performing under pressure, avoiding normal conflict because I do not want to have to confront someone. You know how it is. Story 21. Meh, it was normally the same thing. Mom would line us up in the kitchen and scream at us until we started to cry. Then she'd say, "Oh, you're scared now, you want to cry? I'll give you something to cry about," and then beat us. When we stopped crying from getting beat, we would start laughing instead. And so she said, "Oh, you think this is funny? I'll give you something to laugh about," and then rinse and repeat. Between that, getting backhanded in the face, getting shoved into things by my hair, once had to clean the baseboards with a toothbrush. I told my dad about all of it, and he took her to court to try to get custody. When I was waiting with my stepdad's parent, I was forced to write the Bible verse about honoring your parents over and over because telling my dad about what she was doing was not honoring her. My mom had to spend money and hire a lawyer because of what I said, and she didn't have the money to do that, so it was my fault. We once got beat because my mom was convinced that we stole her oxycodone and sold it at school. We were in second and third grade. Probably the worst I remember is when I got held down and beat on Christmas Eve, and then my mom tucked me in and told me Santa was coming. But my mom also told me that leaving bruises on your kid is normal and that every parent does it when I asked her why she left bruises on me. Story 22. Beatings, starvation, and being forced to stand naked in front of siblings, walk on all fours like a dog, not eat for days, and lay for 7 hours in a dark basement on concrete for being quiet when I'm mad. I was beaten 50 times with various objects and threatened to be shot and maced for asking about my dad and feeling sad he left my life when I was young. I have sadistic parents who really take pleasure in pain. Story 23. Got locked in the small storage room and was forbidden to turn the lights on, leaving me in the dark while I was scared of the dark. All this because I couldn't memorize a single multiplication table. Still sleeping with a light on and having anxiety attacks when alone in the dark. Story 24. I was 5 or 6 years old and had a bad habit of chewing on my nails. My father caught me again. He repeatedly beat me with a belt until I had belt-shaped marks all over my body. Story 25. Asian here, got caught smoking at 16 years old, and my dad used a cane, which is around half an inch in diameter, to whip my face a few times. I bled and was bruised for about 2 weeks before it eased down. After that, I still had to go to school and lie to my classmates, saying that I got stung by a hornet each time they asked about the bruise. Story 26. So I grew up in a very abusive household. My mother was a narcissist, and my father an alcoholic with a temper. He has now been recovered for 2 years, although his temper is still present. I'll give 3 events that stick with me the most, in order from most severe to least severe below. The day after I turned 13, it was a Sunday morning. I was trying to finish a school project that was due the next day. I couldn't complete it on Friday because the birthday celebration with friends took place that night, and I couldn't complete it on Saturday because the birthday celebration with family took place that day. I was already failing the class that my project was due for, and I didn't want to fail the project because I'd have to repeat 6th grade. I had already repeated 4th grade due to the lack of special education programs in my private school. My parents were harsh about grades too, but as I was trying to finish my school project, my father was already drunk at 9 a.m. and yelled at me to fold my laundry. I calmly stated that I'd do it as soon as I finished my school project. He flew off the handle, calling me lazy, and I started crying. He accused me of faking the crying for sympathy. And it made me angry with frustration to the point of storming off to my room, slamming the door. A few seconds after I slammed the door, my father kicked down my unlocked door, immediately picked me up by the shoulders, and screamed in my face about slamming doors in his house, getting tobacco spit in my eyes and mouth. He then threw me onto my left shoulder. I immediately started crying and screaming in pain and vomited all over my pajamas, hair, and carpet. My mother finally came out of their bedroom, pretending like she just woke up. I remember she looked at me like she was annoyed and told me to just suck it up and fold the laundry and that I was being dramatic. I cried uncontrollably for 2 hours, struggling to fold the laundry with my injury. My mother came in to yell at me for taking too long and dilly-dallying. Her demeanor changed unnaturally quickly when she noticed my limited range of motion in my left arm. She seemed more worried about the possibility of a future call to Child Protective Services made by a teacher when I went to school the next day, rather than my safety. She took me to the emergency room. Mind you, we had 2 at the time, and of course, she not only took me to the furthest one away from our house, but also the one that had notoriously long wait times. My collarbone was snapped, a clean break. The doctor prescribed me morphine, thus leading to a long-term opiate addiction added to pre-existing addictions that I was already struggling with. I weighed about 60 pounds at the time, and I was about 5 feet 2 inches tall. Plenty of reasons that the cop I had talked to in the hospital had to be able to make an arrest on both of my parents and place my younger brother and me in foster care, but he didn't. My father was never charged for it, and was only advised to seek psychiatric treatment for his anger issues. No alcohol rehab or Alcoholics Anonymous was ever mentioned to him. He wasn't allowed to see me for the time it took for my injury to heal fully. My mother still willingly let him back into our lives despite his not quitting drinking and despite refusing mental health services. I finally entered foster care at nearly 17 years old when I was discovered to have had a severe drug addiction. From ages 10 to 16 and a half, my parents would regularly lock me in my bedroom without food or water. Food and drink weren't allowed in kids' bedrooms, and they would beat me if I managed to escape, soil myself or the furniture or carpet due to a lack of access to the bathroom, or just being loud when locked up. This one I didn't realize was abuse until I was already aged out of foster care and lightheartedly retelling the story. A classmate asked me why I freak out and gag over just a little fuzz getting in my mouth. When I was 10, my parents decided to teach me how to do my own laundry due to my frequent accidents from incontinence. They refused to buy me bladder products because it was enabling my incontinence. My father was very adamant about cleaning the lint trap, which is understandable as it is a fire hazard. On the second or third load to go through the dryer, I had forgotten to clean out the lint trap. I heard my father yell at me to come to the laundry room. I went because it didn't sound like he was inherently upset. I walked in and opened my mouth to ask what he needed me to do, and the next thing I knew, all the lint I had forgotten to remove from the lint trap was shoved into my mouth.